At a remote military base in North Carolina, a group of elite Delta Force operators, known for their unmatched skill and swagger, laughed off an old veteran's faded tattoo, dismissing him as a relic of a bygone era. The man, weathered and unassuming, stood quietly as the jeers echoed. Then, a four-star general, silent until that moment, rolled up his sleeve, revealing a mark that stopped the room cold and turned their mockery into stunned respect. Jim Callahan, 68, was a familiar face around Fort Bragg, though few knew his full story. A retired Army veteran, he often visited the base to mentor young soldiers or share a beer with old comrades. His slight limp and gray hair made him easy to overlook, but his eyes carried a sharpness that hinted at a life of hard-won experience. On this particular day in September 2025, he was invited to a training session observation, a rare chance for civilians to see Delta Force in action. The session was held in a secure hangar, where a dozen of the unit's finest were running drills under the watchful eye of General Marcus Tate, a decorated leader with a reputation for discipline and loyalty to his troops. The Delta operators were the best of the best, lean, confident, and battle-hardened. They moved with precision, their gear cutting-edge, their banter sharp. During a break, Jim, dressed in a simple flannel shirt and jeans, stood near the edge of the group, watching quietly. His left forearm bore a faded tattoo, a dagger piercing a skull, surrounded by faint scrollwork. One of the operators, a young sergeant named Ryan Carter, noticed it and smirked. "Hey, Pops, what's that ink? You get that in Nam or something?" The others chuckled, their tone light but edged with condescension. Another operator, Specialist Ethan Brooks, chimed in. "It's like something my grandpa would have gotten at a county fair." Jim didn't flinch. He glanced at the tattoo, then back at the group, his expression unreadable. "It's from a long time ago," he said simply, his voice steady but low. The operators, expecting a story or a defense, were disappointed by his brevity. Carter pressed. "Come on, old-timer, what's the deal? You some kind of weekend warrior back in the day?" The laughter grew louder, and a few others joined in, tossing playful jabs about Jim's age and the tattoo's crude design. To them, he was just a retired grunt, a man whose time had passed. General Tate, standing at the far end of the hangar, had been observing the exchange. At 55, he was a towering figure, his uniform crisp, his presence commanding. He'd been reviewing training logs with a colonel, but paused when he heard the laughter. His eyes narrowed as he watched Jim, who stood calmly, letting the mockery wash over him. The general excused himself from the colonel and walked toward the group, his boots echoing on the concrete floor. The operators straightened up, their laughter fading as Tate approached. Jim, however, didn't move, his gaze fixed on the ground. "Something funny, gentlemen?" Tate's voice was calm but carried an edge that silenced the room. Carter, still grinning, gestured toward Jim. "Just giving the vet here a hard time about his tattoo, sir. No harm meant." Tate's eyes flicked to Jim's forearm, then back to Carter. "Is that so?" he said, his tone unreadable. Without another word, he unbuttoned his right sleeve and rolled it up, revealing a tattoo of his own, a dagger piercing a skull, nearly identical to Jim's, though sharper and less faded. The room went still. The operators exchanged glances, their confidence replaced by confusion. "Recognize this?" Tate asked, his voice steady but piercing. He held up his arm, letting the tattoo catch the light. The operators stared, unsure how to respond. Carter stammered, "Sir, that's—" "It's like his." Tate nodded, his eyes locking onto Carter's. "It's not just like his. It's the same. And there's a reason for that." He turned to Jim, who met his gaze with a faint nod. A silent acknowledgement of something unspoken between them. Tate addressed the group, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "This tattoo isn't some county fair souvenir. It's the mark of the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta, from a time when most of you were still in diapers. Jim Callahan wasn't just a soldier. He was one of the first to wear this ink, one of the first to build what you now call Delta Force." The operators' faces fell. Carter's smirk vanished, replaced by a mix of shock and embarrassment. Brooks shifted uncomfortably, his earlier bravado gone. Tate continued, his tone unwavering. Jim was part of the unit's founding in the late 1970s, back when it didn't even have a name. He ran missions you'll never read about, in places you'll never know existed. He trained men who trained you. That tattoo you mocked? It's a badge of honor, earned in blood and sweat. Jim remained silent, his expression unchanged, but his eyes softened slightly as Tate spoke. The general went on, recounting a piece of history few in the room knew. In 1977, when Delta Force was formed to counter rising global threats, Jim Callahan was among the handful of Green Berets handpicked by Colonel Charlie Beckwith to create the unit. At 20, he was a prodigy in unconventional warfare, the knack for improvisation and a fearlessness that bordered on reckless. His early missions, from hostage rescues in Southeast Asia to counter-terrorism ops in the Middle East, helped shape Delta's tactics and reputation. The tattoo, designed by Beckwith himself, was a symbol of their brotherhood, inked only on those who survived the grueling selection process and proved themselves in the field. Tate's tattoo, inked decades later, was a tribute to that legacy. As a young officer in the 1990s, he'd trained under men who'd served with Jim, hearing stories of his exploits, how he'd once led a team through a desert ambush, saving 6 men, or how he'd infiltrated a hostile compound alone to gather intel that stopped a terrorist attack. Tate had chosen the same tattoo to honor those early pioneers, men like Jim who'd built the foundation for the unit's success. The operators listened, their earlier mockery replaced by a growing sense of awe. Carter, now pale, managed a quiet, "I didn't know, sir." Tate's gaze softened, but his voice remained firm. "You didn't know because Jim doesn't talk about it. Men like him don't need to. They carry their stories and their scars, not their words." He gestured toward Jim, who finally spoke, his voice low but clear. "I'm not here to brag, son. I'm here to see what you've done with what we started." The room stayed quiet for a long moment. Then Brooks, swallowing hard, stepped forward. "Mr. Callahan, I'm sorry. We didn't mean any disrespect." The others murmured apologies, their tone sincere. Jim waved a hand, dismissing the tension. "No harm done. You boys are doing good work. Just keep it up." His words were simple, but they carried weight. Quiet endorsement from a man who'd seen it all. Tate clapped Jim on the shoulder, a rare gesture of camaraderie from the stoic general. "This man's why you're here," he told the operators. "You're standing on his shoulders. Don't forget it." He then invited Jim to address the group, something he rarely did. Jim hesitated, then spoke, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. He didn't recount his missions or list his accolades. Instead, he talked about the men he'd served with, friends who didn't come home, sacrifices that went uncelebrated. He spoke of loyalty, of pushing past fear, of remembering why they fought. "You're not just soldiers," he said. "You're brothers. Act like it." The operators hung on his every word, their earlier arrogance replaced by respect. Carter, still shaken, asked Jim about one of the missions Tate had mentioned, a 1980 operation in Iran that had gone unpublicized. Jim smiled faintly, shaking his head. "Some stories stay buried, son. Let's just say we got the job done." His refusal to boast only deepened their admiration. As the session ended, the operators approached Jim one by one, shaking his hand, some asking for advice or stories. He answered humbly, deflecting attention to their training and potential. General Tate watched, a rare smile breaking through his stern demeanor. Later, over beers at a local bar, Tate pulled Jim aside. "You didn't have to let them rib you like that," he said. Jim shrugged. "Keeps M grounded. Besides, I've heard worse." Word of the incident spread through Fort Bragg then beyond. The Delta operators, known for their secrecy, shared the story quietly among themselves, a reminder to check their egos. Jim's name became a quiet legend. It's not for his tattoo, but for what it represented. A life of service, uncelebrated but undeniable. Tate, in his reports to the Pentagon, made a point to mention Jim's visit. Ensuring his contributions were noted, if not publicized, Jim continued his visits to the base, mentoring when asked, but never seeking the spotlight. The operators, especially Carter and Brooks, made a point to greet him warmly, their respect now unwavering. The tattoo, once a source of mockery, became a symbol of pride, a reminder that greatness doesn't always shout its presence. And General Tate, whenever he rolled up his sleeve, carried that lesson forward, ensuring the legacy of men like Jim Callahan lived on in the unit they'd built.